Sup. So, this is going to be a new experiment. A very new experiment. I'm going to see if it's working, because that is always what I do when I start something new. Lots of new elements, or really just one new element this time, but I think it's kinda cool. It's a little mini me that talks and jumps and stuff. Very cool. But aside from that, the plan is to look over a bunch of Alliance histories, read through them thoroughly, and get a grasp of their character and the story that they have contributed to the game Politics and War. And ideally, this is made in such a way that it is entertaining for people to watch back after it's published. So we're going to be disseminated a bit. But for the people that do arrive, apparently, at some point, then they'll also get to engage and do a sort of a Q&A at different points. So that's the goal, and hopefully it's an improvement on some of the other radios in PNW in some ways, not always, but in some. So the three alliances that we're going to be looking at are Rose, the Syndicate, and the Knights Radiant, I believe, because they have pretty interesting stories on their wikis. And rather unfortunately, the keyboard will probably be loud, so sorry about that. At least initially. So we're going to do this. I've pinned it. There we go, triple it. And we might actually be able to find the others in their wars. Spoilers. Why are they fighting random alliances? Where are the big ones? This is madness. What the hell? Yeah, Hollywood. Okay. Where's Rose? I thought they should be here easily. That's so here we go. Right at the beginning. Who do we want to start with? I kind of want to start with Rose first. And I have no clue what that looks like on the other screen because I messed it up. But whatever. 2 seconds. Cool. Working. So Rose is an alliance founded by members of the Atlas Confederacy, following its disbandment in the War of Purple Aggression. Founding members of Rose include ex-government from the Empire of Spades Alliance. The name of the alliance, Rose, also has ties with an alliance from Pixel Nations called Empire of Rose, which disbanded in 2013. Pixel Nations was the precursor to Politics and War, also developed by Alex. I met the founder of Empire of Spades. They are an interesting bunch. Do I want to start before Rose in some sense to ground them, or just go through their history? I think it's probably better to tell their version of the story, and then to go back and try and add to it if we're able to, and contribute like interesting commentary, I guess. But we should probably think about Atlas Confederacy. If they don't mention it, then we will. Okay, so he's not talking too much about the Atlas Confederacy. They were basically, a very small alliance in early PNW, but quite influential in their own way. So at the dawn of the Empire, Pub Stomper. The founder and first leader of Rose was Pub Stomper, formerly a leading member of the Atlas Confederation and Corn Shuckers. He disbanded TAC and reformed the alliance under the name Rose in November of 2014. Makes sense. Most of the other big alliances, I think, formed around that time, or earlier in August. Pub espoused an ideology that emphasized building a strong community within the alliance and helping to okay, nonsense. Okay, so they're just saying they have a very strong community, which I would agree, though mainly that's because Rose contrasted the other powers of the time, which focused more on, I think, economy and military. They were not a great power in either sense. So under Pub, Rose cooperated with Guardian and Seven Kingdoms in the creation of the Marionette Coalition, a group whose main objective was to displace the Covenant as the dominant power in Orbis. To this end, the Marionette Coalition declared war against the Covenant bloc on December 11th, 2014, beginning the Marionette War. Rose's declaration of war labeled the Covenant an unjust power, and declarations from Guardian and Seven Kingdoms expressed views that the Covenant held hegemonic ambitions. Interesting. I wonder if we can find that in any of their DOWs. So this is their first declaration of war, according to the wiki. Rose will never accept the tyranny of unjust powers. Something must and will be done. To stand up to that which is worth defeating is the highest honor that one can be bestowed. To stand against evil is one's only purpose worth having. To fight for the innocent and the weak is the only truth worth possessing. And these are the axioms of Rose. That is very interesting. They are kind of still a balancing power in the game currently. Like, they never have been part of, I'd say, huge coalitions. They've more so been a power that's on the periphery of coalitions. So that's kind of interesting. They kind of held to their principles, at least from my brief understanding of their politics. But we will continue to analyze that as we go through. So this is the continuation to a promise and contract made in a war that never ended. I think this is in reference to some sort of pirate dispute. And yeah, this is a very iconic lineup with Kigos and Avas. I think some of these other people are interesting too, but I don't know them very well. Actually, I think he was probably GPA at this point. Gerdnak. He's a very famous Rose person now, but yeah, I think he was GPA back then. GPA was like a great neutral alliance that no longer exists. Yeah, okay. So Marionette War, they fight, they win, I think pretty decisively. Yeah, they claimed a victory, but they white-pieced it, as is most wars in this game. So, actually, before I continue, let's check if there's any comments. Rose is not declaring war on someone today, unfortunately. They're declaring war on someone yesteryear. The Terminus Est and New Shrek Order would also side with our Marionette, which proved to be the vastly more powerful side, well yeah, Guardian and Seven Kingdoms, versus UPN. However, the war concluded in a white peace after 11 days. That is a very short global. That is a meme in today's politics. So the peace talks for this war were famously disastrous. Seven Kingdoms wanted to lay severe conditions on the Covenant, such as forcing them to decommission their missile launch pads. This is back when I think infrastructure was very small, like 300 was high end for or something. So missile launch pads were kind of like nukes. Now, I think. Yeah. So Rose disagreed with this, believing that the war damage they had sustained was already punishing enough. Rose leaders felt that Guardian and Seven Kingdoms were trying to play up Rose's role as Marionette's ringleader, which they might have hoped would serve to make Rose the focus of any animosity felt by the Covenant. Ultimately, the parties settled for a white peace just in time for Christmas. So this was back when all of these alliances were fairly powerful, if I remember correctly. And we can check the stats using the war rankings, but I think Seven Kingdoms at least was a very major power. Yeah, so these guys weren't small. They were pretty fierce competitors, and Rose was a rising power at the time. I'm surprised that UPN is that small. I thought they were number 1. Oh no, I got it flipped. This is afterwards. This is before, I think. So yeah. UPN, Empire of Spades, very strong. Atlas Confederacy was way stronger than I thought it was. But yeah, half the membership. And then after the war, Guardian and Seven Kingdoms became much stronger. Rose stayed about the same. UPN, etc. fell. GPA was the real winner here. But yeah, let's continue. Ultimately, the party settled for a white peace just in time for Christmas. Shortly after the Marionette War, Pub Stomper stepped down as Emperor of Rose, having led alliances for most of the year. He was ready to take a break and swing over to a new alliance with a Dharma called Rothschild. And Adama was the head of Milcom, I think, from that DOW. So they lost half their government, including their leader, during that war. So the creation of Rothschild would prove to be a major test for Rose, as it caused one of the sharpest drop-offs in membership in the Alliance's history. At the end of the Marionette War, Rose had 76 members, but by January, Rose had only 50. If they started the war with like 50 people... Where is this? I'm trying to find it because I think they started it with 50. Yeah, they started with 60. They got up to 70 during the war, and then they fell down to 50. So yeah, that's pretty rough. The tragedy of Angelus the Wise. A bit of propagandizing. Following Pub Stomper's resignation, the former Lord of Internal Affairs Angelus was elected unopposed in what he himself suggested was a fake election. Angelus was a veteran of cybernations, a prominent figure in the New Polar Order. No, I liked Rose. Kinda. How could they? This origin story is atrocious. I will never forgive them. Okay, but he was regarded as competent and experienced. Pub Stomper had more or less picked him to be a successor despite the Alliance Charter requiring that the Emperor had to be elected. That's interesting. So they kept fairly warm relations with the Splinter Alliance if they basically nominated his successor. So Angelus was a pragmatic and principled leader, but unfortunately his leadership would be cut short by a major scandal. Cyrodius, a former member of Empire of Spades, and the Lady of Resources and Rose, I would assume that's Econ, leaked government logs showing that Rose was going to oppose their former wartime partner, Guardian. That's interesting. Who would they be working against? Or who would be working with them? Who would they be working with against Guardian? That is an interesting question. I don't know. I'll need to ask them at some point. Furthermore, the logs showed Rose government members referring to Viridian Entente, VE, and the Syndicate as meat shields for the coming war. Actually, these logs are probably on the forums, but they're hidden somewhere. They definitely weren't linked here. But yeah, they referred to Viridian Entente and the Syndicate as meat shields. That must have been during Paragon then. Unless I'm woefully wrong. No, it's too early for Paragon. Maybe Syndicate and Rose had like some sort of temporary treaty or relations back then. I know there were like protectorates being traded in really weird ways. So whilst Angelus had intended to remain in leadership, the diplomatic pressure targeted at Rose combined with animosity from a handful of members within the alliance led by the Lord of Internal Affairs, Kurdenak, to ask him to resign. Following a discussion, Angelus agreed to step down. So that seems like a lot of internal politics. But it shows not an awareness of external pressure, right? That they changed their internal affairs to avoid destruction. Whereas I think some alliances like Seven Kingdoms or even Guardian back then wouldn't have done that. So they were already operating a bit differently from other alliances. So Kurdenak had joined Rose towards the end of 2014, also serving as a triumvirate, the benevolent usurper. Interesting. After serving as a triumvirate in the Green Protection Agency, he served as Lord of Internal Affairs in Rose. After Angelus stepped down, Kurdenak assumed leadership, appointing Angelus as his regent, and immediately began implementing plans to resolve the Cyrodius scandal. Okay, this is a lot of sort of internal disputes, which I don't think are actually that interesting, I guess. Like, they don't actually shape the alliance's character all that much. The next challenge was the decline in Rose membership. Okay, this is bigger, because how they tackle that problem does reflect on the alliance. To fix this issue, Kurdenak tasked Belisarius, another former GPA triumvirate, with revamping the recruitment process. So Rose took on people, but also strategies from GPA. That is very interesting. So they have elements of NPO, New Polar Order, and GPA. That is definitely an origin story. Through a combination of Rothschild members slowly returned to Rose and Belisarius's recruiting, Rose ended up with more than 80 members by May 2015. That's pretty good. I think even until quite recently that was very high membership. But this is an early stage in the game when it was very small. So they were probably one of the largest, if not the largest alliance in the game, outside of maybe UPN. The UPN's members, there was probably like more inactives in UPN than Rose back then. So Kodenek's leadership was centered on internal reforms, and he took a mostly neutral stance in the major politics of Orbis at the time. But the tectonic plates upon which great powers sit never cease to move. That is a quote he's borrowed from someone else, though the analogy is not new. And whilst Rose was occupied with eternal matters, there was a storm brewing on the world stage. Very flamboyant author. Guardian and SK, who Rose had grown distant from since their partnership in the Marionette Coalition, but was still closest thanks to allies that Rose had, were a long-established sphere in the midst of a gentle decline. Okay. There's no mention of TS here. I guess there was earlier, but this is before TS's rise. Surely the Covenant wasn't gaining power. Yeah, the Covenant were another major sphere weakened from their wartime losses, but after the Marionette War, a new power had burst onto the scene, the Viridian Entente. VE was like, I don't know if that's enough to say they're in decline. Yeah, VE didn't like result in both other spheres declining. I think it just changed the relative power. VE started in December and reached the #1 spot on the Alliance ranking within 2 months. They were large but untested in battle. Guardian and SK sought to change this. So VE is an interesting creature. I'm no expert on it, but I think they were a mostly neutral alliance in Cybernations. So the fact when they came over here, they were a more political force, I think was somewhat new for them. Not entirely, but a little bit. The reign of Kigos. So Kodenek had picked Rose up, repaired the damage from previous past events, and left the war in a much stronger position than when he started. Left the Alliance in a much stronger position than when he started. But Kodenek has always asserted that he is better. Okay, whatever. He wanted to choose a successor who could handle the massive potential of Rose, and one of the best FA brains in the Alliance at the time was Kigos. Well, Kigos did Econ, Abbas did FA, so I guess they switched at some point. Or Abbas retired, as he is wont to do. Kodenek resigned in March 2015, and Kigos was elected unopposed to Emperor. Kigos quickly got to work orchestrating what many believed would be Rose's rise to supremacy. Yeah, okay. They were competing with some pretty fierce rivals back then. So at the time that Kigos became Emperor, Guardian and Seven Kingdoms' plan to take down VE was in the works. Guardian, Seven Kingdoms, Termtest, Mence HQ, and Rose made up the aggressive coalition, and I cannot think of a scarier coalition. Even today, if you transplanted that coalition, it would be a fearsome creature. So Viridian Entente had the support of Cornerstone and the Black Knights, as well as 2 members of the Covenant, UPN, and Brotherhood of the Clouds, and that is probably the most woeful coalition I could have ever composed. So before the war could begin, a massive leak from Seven Kingdoms happened. The leak revealed that Seven Kingdoms was planning to have Rose attacked and rolled after using them to take down VE. As a result, Rose switched to VE's side. Furthermore, Test switched sides as well, which left Guardian Seven Kingdoms in a terrible position. They did not show the leaks. like they didn't link to it, because those are fantastic, and I will never miss a chance to talk about them because they are so entertaining. Here we go. I believe I spoke to, I forget who it was in Rose I spoke to, but I believe Rose was the one that actually found these leaks and they handed them over to VE. Yeah, the short version is that Seven Kingdoms did all their FA planning on their forums, because all alliances used forums back then, and they plotted to attack VE with Seven Kingdoms and Guardian, sorry, plotted to attack VE with Rose and Acadia, but during that war, then Acadia would take all the damage versus VE, like the others would sort of hold back, and then after the war was over, then they would work with Rose to roll Acadia, and then after Acadia and VE were in ruins, then Guardian and Seven Kingdoms would team up to take down Rose, and then they would reign as like King of the Ashes. So it was a very cool plot from a story perspective, and it blew up spectacularly because it got leaked, and the coalition got rolled. And to my knowledge, there was no leadership changes, at least not immediately. So that's quite a contrast to Rose, which changed its leader quite quickly to avoid war. So though it was clear at this point that because of the leak, Guardian Seven Kingdoms had blundered into a losing war, they decided to attack anyways and hoped their blitz would be effective enough to give them an insurmountable lead early on. Very ambitious, but again, they were like the premier military powers of the day. And thus the Great VE War began, and the 19th May 2015, VE achieved a sweeping victory by 10th of June. I don't think that's because of VE's like power. I think that's because they had numbers. Like Guardian Seven Kingdoms were literally taking on the whole game. So the formation of Paragon, actually I think you can see that in the war list. Yeah, this is I think most of the game, with a few alliances excluded. So the formation of Paragon. This is a really interesting part of the document because it contrasts with the Syndicate's version of events. They have a very different story. So, after the Great VE War, Guardian and Seven Kingdoms effectively lost their place as a great power, whilst Viridian Entente and the Covenant remained great powers. They're lumping the Covenant together, which I guess isn't wholly inaccurate, but they were like a block, right? They're a sphere. I think Viridian Entente was a singular alliance. Rose, and TS were singular alliances. But that sort of, it gives you an idea of how Rose viewed the Covenant at the time. That even though UPN was probably a peer competitor in terms of size, their whole sphere was only really worth one of the other majors. Like that is sort of the level of incompetence you were dealing with back then. Not that any of these alliances were, I'd say, even kinda competent by today's standards. So with only two credible great powers remaining, the world became bipolar. The top-level alliances, such as Rose and the Syndicate, now had to choose a side. That is interesting. So it's the bipolarity is between Viridian Entente and Covenant. If Guardian SK have declined so much, I guess that makes some sense. There's some irony to it, which we'll come to later, because VE and Covenant had to work together. So with only two, they had to pick a side. The animosity between Rose and VE, caused by leaks, seemed to disappear after the Great VE War, and the two alliances started to get closer together. Despite this, VE was contemplating whether it may actually be a better idea to cooperate with the other major power, the Covenant, rather than compete with them. Discussions between VE and UPN initially indicated that the two would be signing a treaty, which would have created a massive hegemonic sphere. I don't know how hegemonic that would be in retrospect. I would have given that like a year, if that. However, both TS and Rose were against this. As it would have left them in an unfavorable situation. The two alliances worked together to change VE's mind, reminding them of the careful balance of power and how they would potentially be able to rival TC by working together. After much heated debate, VE signed a block with Rose and the Syndicate, thus Paragon was born. So at the time of its formation, Paragon was the strongest sphere in the game, as it had 3 of the top 5 alliances as well as their allies. So to counter a hegemonic bloc, they created a hegemonic bloc. DEIC were a top 5 alliance at this point, as they had avoided fighting in the war and just kept growing. Oh, okay, that's interesting. Because they were meant to take the brunt of the damage in the VE war, according to the original plot. So by staying out, I guess they were the real winners of that war. But their allies, UPN and BOC, had fought and sustained losses and were lower in the rankings. Strong though it may have been, there were a lot of problems, differences, and divisions that would spell disaster for the bloc down the road. These issues all began with a disagreement over who Paragon was going to fight first. I think this vaguely references disagreements with Partisan and I forget the VE person, but there were a lot of personality conflicts. So Rose was at odds with Mensa HQ due to intense conflict, out-of-character conflict, and in-game raiding of their protectorates, and wanted to roll them. So VE wanted to finish off the old hegemony by attacking Test, despite the fact that Test had assisted them in the past conflict, and TS wanted to just get on with it and fight TC. So because of these differences, the Syndicate left Paragon. Okay, so it seems to me, without having consulted Syndicate's version of events yet, Syndicate wanted to deal with the UPN threat, and they were closer with Mensa HQ and Guardian and the rest. VE wanted to continue rolling Guardian and the rest, and had somewhat warm relations with TC, even if they were kind of afraid of them. And Rose has issues with Mensa HQ, but otherwise sort of just puts it down to the balance of power. That's why they participated. I think this was longer before. Because if you talk to Rose people, they definitely say that they were pressured into the block by Syndicate. So it seems they've removed that. Or it comes up later. Actually, it might be here, but we'll see. So resignation of Kigos in Kigos' place, Pub Stomper stepped up to handle the Alliance's foreign affairs, serving as Rose's primary diplomat and the main line of communication to VE and TS. Okay, so Pub Stomper returns, Kigos leaves. The Syndicate leaves Paragon. I think they've messed up here. I think they did rewrite this section, and that's why they say that Syndicate leaves here, and then they have a whole section on Syndicate leaving here. Yeah, so this should actually be further down. Whatever. I guess we don't need to comment too much on how they've altered their history since. I think the important part is what they've actually written. And yeah, no, it is actually live. I just don't reply to comments all that frequently. I do check them somewhat, though. So, where am I at? So the Syndicate began orchestrating a plan to start a war against the Covenant. They planned to cooperate with Test and Arg, 2 paperless alliances, by faking tensions with them. That's interesting. You don't see this so much now, because if one of the majors militarize, all of them sort of have to. But yeah, it tells you something about the Syndicate. And we'll see if Syndicate mentions that this was their plan in their version of events, because they might not. So they would have militarized while publicly attacking each other verbally to make it seem that tensions were rising between the two groups. This is still a very effective strategy in the lower tier, by the way, though I'd argue that you could probably militarize in the lower tier and no one would care or notice. So once they reached maximum militarization, Paragon, Test, and Arg would attack the Covenant, who would presumably not be on max military, taking them completely by surprise. That would be the most uncompetitive war imaginable. It is downright diabolical, you know? To fight the hegemony, we need to create a hegemonic force and then team up with all the mercenaries in the game. And then we're also going to be militarized. So there's absolutely zero chance that the opponent fights back in the slightest. And this is all balance of power politics. Like, I don't think they've listed a single CB. That's so interesting. Because if you talk to people now, they're like, well, back in the day, CBs were really important. Were they? Were they really? But okay. Actually, this might tie into why Syndicate's kind of famous for its realpolitik. For focusing more on balance of powers and sort of their political interest than anything else. Right? They don't care so much. Actually, I think it was hyped up. So I think that's why that character persists with them. That narrative, though its accuracy now and after this point is probably dubious. We'll get to that in their story. But the word realpolitik is or was associated with them. Yeah, let's continue. So whilst the plan was still being developed by TS, Test, and Arg, neither VE or Rose had yet been consulted. Developed by TS and the mercenaries, they did this without consulting their allies. So VE still wanted to attack Test because it saw them as a remnant of the old hegemony. Was Test on UPN's side? Or I thought they were on Guardians. But Guardians was never, they were never really hegemony. They took down the old hegemony. I don't know if their new one could even be called that. Because the new one, with between Rose, Guardian, and SK, that was way too fractured. They were competing. At least Rose and the rest, so. Presumably the plan would have been brought to VE and Rose when it had been fleshed out in greater detail, but before TS was able to let its allies know, the plan was leaked. Yeah, they kind of messed up on that one. It's weird that Rose softens that, right? Because I think this is just a clear, mistake by TS, right? They plotted a war without telling their allies. Surely they should have clued them in initially, at least to see if they would have, approved of the idea. So Cynic, one of the founders of the Syndicate, got hold of logs of TS government discussing this plan and publicly leaked them. Cynic is a very interesting character. He features in many different stories in PNW, and always as sort of an agent of chaos. Sort of not a trickster, but he's like chaotic neutral in some sense. I wouldn't call him evil, not because I know him that well, but just because the way he features in stories, it's always kind of weird. It's not necessarily out of self-interest, I guess. He stole Bad Company's bank and then tricked the Alliance into thinking it was someone else in the Alliance. And I don't think he profited much from that. He gave the bank away in the end. So he just causes chaos. So the Syndicate VE demanded the removal of TS as FA head partisan. The Syndicate refused, and on the August 8th decided to leave Paragon and pursue a new objective, the the creation of their own sphere. And this again will come up in the TS version, I think, but it was the fact that VE demanded the removal. That's why Partisan wasn't removed. If VE had probably just left it or applied sort of soft pressure, then, their soft power, then TS, which was already angry at Partisan for messing this up, might have removed him. But it was the fact that they demanded it. They united them and prevented the removal. Which is an interesting contrast to Rose, again, because Rose removed their removed their leader or whatever, to avoid getting rolled. And so if you switch this around, Rose probably would have removed their FA head if they were faced by similar pressure. So it's a difference in sort of character. And I don't think that's too inaccurate to say because they had a whole section on it. That's something they're trying to convey. So a few days after TS left Paragon, Pubstopper contacted DEIC and signed an MDOAP on August 10th. The next day, TS signed an MDP with Mensa HQ, Rose's main rival. On August 12th, Rose brought its protectorate, Vanguard, into Paragon to replace TS. So now you have the rivalry brewing between TS and Rose. They're firmly on different sides of the game, and they're allied to the Alliance the other likes least. And TS, in Rose's case, they're allied to VE, which had a falling out with TS, and TS is now allied to Mensa. And the Covenant is sitting on the sidelines and eating popcorn. So the proxy war. Mensa HQ, now part of the budding Cindersphere, along with TS and Guardian, declared war on Vanguard on the 21st of August 2015. The DEIC treaty made it so Cindersphere could not directly attack Rose, as it would result in a much stronger coalition being brought down on them, i.e. it would drag in the Covenant. So Mensa also had a treaty with UPN. By attacking Vanguard, the intent was to goad a response from Rose. If Rose hit Mensa first, then UPN would be brought in on Cindersphere's side, which would be unfavorable for Rose. Rose decided to circumvent the issue by attacking Mensa's allies rather than Mensa themselves. So on 23rd of August, Rose declared a war on TS. Unfortunately, the blitz timing had been leaked to TS, who informed their members to be active and met the paltry Rose hit. I wonder if this is the famous one-man blitz. I think that was Kigar's, so I don't think so. But yeah, they've had a lot of failed blitzes in their time. They've had some cool ones, though. I think they blitzed at like 3 a.m. I mean, most of the players are American at this time, so like it caught them all off guard. I think for them, DC was like 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. or whatever. Daylight savings, I think, messes with it, or has messed with it a few times. So the war swung decisively in Cindersphere's favor, but on the 1st of September, due to the game being hacked, the game admin rolled it back. This erased much of TS's gains, and neither side wished to prolong the fight. That's like an 8-day war. That is a shockingly short war. Okay, so Paragon surrenders, pays lighter terms. Rose paid nothing in reparations but admitted defeat, and VE paid $100 million to Guardian. I'm not sure if this was a lot or a little back then. Well, either way, it says the terms were diminished, right? Lighter terms. So, I guess 100 mil wasn't as bad as it could have been. Post-proxy, as TC had managed to completely avoid being involved in proxy, they profited massively from selling resources at inflated wartime prices. GPA was also doing this, but because GPA is giant, neutral, and very rich constantly, then I think Test and the rest would have just been permanently looting them. If you look through GPA's history, it's like defeat, 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 defeat. Every 6 months they get rolled, because if they don't routinely roll them, they become like the number one by 2 or 3 times everyone else. It's the same situation as we have kind of with Rose now, where Rose is just way larger than its peers. And if they don't kind of get routinely rolled every year or so, then they will double in size. So as TC, yeah. Okay, continuing on. Yeah, TC was the real winner of Proxy War, as Paragon and Cindersphere expended resources in a costly war, which allowed TC's relative power to soar. If you also view this from sort of a longer time span, then you had Paragon versus Covenant, and Paragon split in two and fought a devastating civil war with reparations and so much bad blood that they will not continue to work together against Covenant in the future, presumably. So, or maybe I'm wrong. Oktoberfest, but yeah, okay. So this was just a huge W for Covenant. If they played it slightly better, then maybe they would have won their later war. Eventually, Pub Stomper secured a treaty with Alpha. However, Alpha and DEIC were bitter enemies, and neither were entirely comfortable cooperating with Rose if it meant being connected to the other. But tentatively, they accepted the arrangement. Pub Stomper identified that in order to put up some opposition to Cindersphere, he needed to prevent Alpha and DEIC from fighting one another. A few months later, the Covenant was defeated and forced to pay massive reparations in Oktoberfest. This time, Rose was not involved in the fighting and made a lot of profit by selling resources. And they emerged as the top alliance in the game. I think probably not for the first time, but after all of that, I'm sure they're very pleased. It's probably a big accomplishment. Yes, they went from number 4 to number 1. It's a pretty big leap. Yeah, so V started aligning with Covenant. I don't think it's Paracov yet, but it's getting closer to Paracov, which was this alliance between Covenant, VE, and Rose. Spoilers. 168-day war. So throughout January 2016, Mensa would begin to raid Vanguard. Mensa, for context, because they've been mentioned a few times now, was a community from E-Republic, and they had like 50 people at the exact same city count when no one else was doing this. So they were... MPO is sort of a bad reference because a lot of new players actually don't know them. They were kind of like Singularity before Singularity. Though the odd Singularity merges and this becomes completely outdated is annoying. Yeah, okay, whatever. They had 50 nations at the same city count when that was very rare to do, and they were also running 100% taxes during rebuilds, which no one else was doing. And Vanguard, which was the alliance that Mensa rolled, ultimately sort of transformed into MPO, which copied some of Mensa's strategies and perfected them. And that's why we have tiering and like high taxes in the form we have today. So Mensa HQ was, for these reasons, a very interesting alliance and sort of a worthy rival to Rose. You know, it was a very interesting grudge and rivalry. I think in the type of, in terms of all-time rivalries in PNW, you have Mensa and Rose, Guardian and not Guardian, Black Knights and the Knights Radiant, Syndicate and Rose, and MPO and TS. So there's a bunch of really interesting beefs, and you can track the game in that way as a clash between rivals and aspiring powers. My voice is dead because I had to talk a lot recently. So throughout January 2016, then Mensa would begin to raid Vanguard. By now, Vanguard had dropped its official ties to Rose and Paragon, but it remained as a paperless ally of Rose. Rose admitted to paperless allies. Interesting. In response to the raids, Vanguard declared war on Mensa. Rose was also accused of funding raids on Cindersphere after it surfaced that the Rum War raids had been financed in part by the Light Federation, a recently acquired Rose satellite. So, so they had to pay reparations, whatever. But this has actually been admitted to. So Rose did do that, and they paid a bunch more, paid for a bunch more raids against the Syndicate. I think Abbas admitted to it while talking to Borhan, which was the former head of FA for Mensa HQ, when talking about how like mercenaries play a huge role in the game. So yeah, I guess they could change that and just say they did fund that. However, neither side wanted to decommission their military, as doing so could have potentially opened up to a devastating attack. A leak revealed that Rose was intending to attack Mensa HQ on over the Vanguard raids. On 3rd of February 2016, Rose declared war on Mensa HQ. The name 168 Day War comes from a propaganda meme Mensa used to mock Rose for not directly attacking them in proxy war when they declared war on Vanguard, who had been under Rose's protection at the time. Between Mensa declaring war and Rose attacking Mensa, 168 days passed. The reason why that's really interesting is because they created a website that ticked up from the initial hit on Vanguard. And it was initially designed to like bait Rose into attacking them. But of course it didn't work. And they left the website up for a year. Like the domain didn't expire or whatever. So yeah, that's how you have 168 days, because that's what the website was at when Rose retaliated. So immediately after the war, Rose was attacked by the entirety of Syndicate, Syndisphere, except for Obsidian Order, which was Black Knights and the Knights Radiant. They were protectorates of Syndicate, but they were both like effectively Cybernations alliances. Well, they had ties there, so they were very experienced, and they weren't presumed to be protectorates for very long. So Obsidian Order had sort of its own FA going on, but it was still very loyal to Syndisphere. So Viridian Entente joined in not long after the war began, and towards the end, UPN would also join Rose's side. Rose had done an incredible job of withstanding the Syndisphere counters, and the wealth Rose had built up while Syndisphere and TC had been fighting at Oktoberfest gave Rose a large cushion of infrastructure to keep income high throughout the war. That's kind of a meme now. But yeah, whatever. However, had UPN not joined, Rose would have lost. The Syndisphere understood that it was realistic for them to keep fighting if TC was going to be coming at them as well, so a white peace was agreed upon. That's interesting. I think there's a map that shows the conflict. I found the website. When will Rose decide? 168 days, 6 hours, 43 minutes, and 43 seconds. Very cool. Yeah, this gives you an idea of the size of the coalitions. But yeah, remove UPN, Acadia, and some of the others from there, because apparently they were not in the war very long. So at the end of 168, Pub Stomper resigned as leader of Rhodes, and elections were held again. Kigos was elected for his second term on 23rd of February 2016. I'm going to see if I can find the charter, because I think a Rose person did give it to me. And wow, I've talked so frequently, or so quickly, that the character is stuck with an open mouth. Wait. Okay. That's not working very well. Jump. Damn. I'm so confused. The moment I get this thing working is also the time when I mess it up. You confuse me, weird program. I'm gonna see if I can restart it. Give me a second. Because I kind of liked having this interesting character on the screen. Well, I mean, yeah, unfortunately, it is required. Okay. I don't know how to fix them. Damn. Wait, okay, I think I figured it out. Yes. See? Fantastic. I'm so good at this. I have no clue what this other button does, but I don't care. Whatever. I think we've dived through a lot of early history, but it feels like there's so much more to do. I think we're about halfway. I kind of want to speed up because this is taking so long. And it's interesting, and we are learning small things about them. But honestly, this feels like more of... How do we put it? Like, Rose isn't telling us much about what they were thinking in these conflicts. I think it's somewhere between a factual explanation, where they're saying this happened for these reasons, with a little bit of commentary, and something of a commentary on other alliances, which I guess is interesting in its own way, right? That they would use their history not as a way to convey their story, but to convey their opinions on others. And they cushion a lot of statements. Like they could be way harsher on other alliances at different times. And I presume that their history, at least internally, is, but for their official one, then they are very neutral. So I'd be curious to know when this was written and by who, and what edits were made. I would not be shocked, because it's Rose, if someone who wrote this thing, I think they list someone, largely the courtesy of Vac, if Vac had drafted it, and then he'd submitted it to the FA department to review before submitting it, or if he first posted it and then they came around later and edited it. I think that would make a lot of sense. And I don't know if that's the case for the later histories that we'll see. I think newer alliances especially, their history is way more overtly biased. I think if there was bias in this account, aside from like small bits of propagandizing, I think it would probably be in the form of selective, like what they put in and what they leave out, not exactly what they're saying. So let's continue. Actually, I'm skipping ahead, aren't I? Or falling behind. So on his way out of office, Pub Stomper was working on a treaty with UPN, which Kigos finished. This would formalize the tie between Paragon and the Covenant, and indicated that the two blocks would begin to operate as a sphere. Okay, yeah, so they were still with the Covenant. Oh, sorry, they were still with Paragon, despite sitting out a war and then fighting 168. Interesting. Yes, this is the formation of Parakov. Paragon is a weird block. Like, it's in between early PNW, where there was like all these moving pieces and lots of alliances vying for power, and sort of mid PNW, I guess, between which was a huge conflict between the Cindersphere and IQ, and then sort of later PNW. It's sort of a more of a return to form as closer to the early days. So Parakov was in between early and mid PNW. It was a transitional period. And Rose's participation in Paragon is probably one of their most defining features because it's shaped so much of their politics since then. Alliances find it very difficult to forget, and they hold really long grudges as a general rule. So, besides this, the rebuild that Rose experienced after 168 days was tremendously successful. Lilac, a former EOS member, led the planning of the rebuild and was largely responsible for getting Rose back into shape after the war. Several key members also began to join in this period: Dermage, Sketchy, Vac, and Roz. That is quite a lineup. All future government members would become active in this alliance during this time and contributed to the alliance internal improvements. This must be a line from when they drafted this. Yeah, so this section, or this earlier section, was probably drafted by Vac at the time they came to power. And this is really like the Reformation lineup. Like, they dramatically changed how Rose worked internally and externally. So several months later, NPO migrated from Cybernations to politics and war. One of NPO's first political moves was to ally with UPN, and this firmly put NPO under the Paragon umbrella. The NPO name came with a lot of controversy from CN, and TS drew attention to how NPO was trying to recruit its massive CN member base to PNW. Synosphere ultimately declared war on NPO and UPN, starting NPO's first time. That is such a short explanation of such a long period of like politics, or like such a dense amount of politics. I don't know if I should expand on it a little bit. For context on why Syndicate didn't like NPO, like, not to get into too much of the weeds, TS and some elements of Rose have ties to an alliance called MI6 in Cybernations, which was sort of a rival to NPO, so there was a lot of beef. And then when there was discussions on both sides of it, from like TS people internally and NPO people internally, they sort of expected to fight each other, I think. That's sort of the long, or the short version of a very long and dense political dispute that will probably be tackled somewhat in this history, but not very much, I would assume, from how short this is. So the only notable event for Rose in this was the betrayal of Storm Division. So one of Rose's protectorates, Storm Division, also had a treaty with BOC, who had left TC and joined Synosphere, and they declared war on the NAC, who were part of Paragon. Rose saw this as a betrayal, cancelled Storm Division, and declared war on them. The war swung in Synosphere's direction early on and led to a decisive Synosphere victory. Rose managed to walk away with only white peace, and were by far the best performers on the Paragon side. I don't know if that's like a great testament to Rose's military power. I think that just says a lot about their allies. Towards August, a small group of the top fighters in Rose formed a splinter group called Oblivion, who allied with Rose. Yeah. Kigos was ready to resign, but before he did, he wanted to take care of the long-awaited task of separating from the Covenant, who had been in decline for a long time and had not been performing to Rose's expectations. Just transplant this up to when you said Rose had a great performance. It had an okay performance. It performed better than its allies, but that's not great. And so on August 8th, 2016, exactly 1 year after TS left Paragon, Rose cancelled all of the MDP treaties except for VE. That's interesting. See, they don't elaborate on why, right? They're just saying they're bad at the game, so we cancelled them. Well, you still need them, right? Like, you're still tied to VE. So what was the rationale? Silent War. So the last thing Kigos intended to do before retiring was to secure at least one new ally to help compensate for cutting TC. and this materialized in the form of an MDP with 7 kingdoms, who had cancelled their Cindersphere ties before signing with Rose. Kigos was allegedly involved in talks with the Knights Radiant over a potential treaty, but the discussions fell through as war tensions grew to a boiling point. Many in Cindersphere took offense to SK's departure, which was perceived as a betrayal. SK's negative forum demeanor towards their former allies displeased Cindersphere. I think Seven Kingdoms has always, or had always envisioned itself as sort of a third pole. Like it wanted to be a great power, like an equal to Covenant and to TS and Rose, but it never really had the numbers or the strength for it, even in the early days. And I think it still wanted to be fairly elite, so it didn't want to become like a mass member alliance. So yeah, I guess they wanted to rule a sphere, but they didn't want to make the sacrifices to actually accomplish it. So a few weeks before all of this, several members of Rose got into a massive argument on the Rose embassy on the TS forums, and a diplomatic crisis took place. Kigos and Partisan were hurling walls of text at each other, and some Gov and even regular members were involved. This would be a really good time to actually link to the walls of text, because those would be really interesting reads, and they're far enough back that they shouldn't be OPSEC anymore, right? These are the two giant alliances of the day. Those word walls were 100% shared around. There is no shot that they are hidden in a corner somewhere that no one will find them. Those will be around. So Kigos appointed a new Lord of FA, Luna, for the sole purpose of quelling the flames of the debate, so this likely contributed to further tensions between Rose and TS. As the conflict loomed ever closer, Rose began to militarize, as did Cindersphere. VE, SK, UPN, MPO, and others. Okay, interesting. So the whole world militarizes. Could have summarized that. However, as tensions dragged on, eventually, Cindersphere began to decommission. What? You're skipping the whole part where you negotiated the decommissioning. They didn't just decide, oh, well, I guess we're gonna lose, time to decommission. No, I'm sure they negotiated. Cindersphere's version of this is going to be wildly different. I can almost guarantee that. So seeing Cindersphere decommission, Paragon started the war and TCMPO joined as well. However, the Blitz was a disaster. Rose attacked TKR and Guardian but had subpar attendance. Only 2 members of VE showed up for their Blitz. They haven't given their members enough notice, and without the activity or motivation, there was no way things were going the way of Paragon and friends, and the war was decided within the first round as Cindersphere's superior activity and coordination proved decisive. Okay, so why? This is not portraying you guys as the good guy. This is just a failure of propagandizing. Some alliances propagandize too much. You guys just blundered that, right? Because this is just overtly portrays you as the bad guy. You're just wrong in this instance, right? You had a disagreement with them, okay. They decommission, and presumably there's negotiation which starts that, because there would be no way they just we're just gonna decommission. And then you attack them anyway. Surely diplomacy would be the route there. Especially the decommission. I don't know. To me, that feels like a propaganda failure. That they aren't properly explaining themselves. If it was a really heated debate, really heated, and we actually had some understanding of what was being discussed, then maybe you could justify some of that, but I don't know. This is kind of trash. Seeing Cindersphere decommission, Paragon started the war, and Already read that. The name Silent War originates from the conspicuous lack of communication between the two spheres in the days leading up to the Blitz. Kigos threw a placeholder declaration of war, saying he would update later, but it wasn't updated until after the war when he actually got around to this. So nobody was quite sure why the fight was taking place at all. And this was as true for befuddled bystanders as it was for actual members and even members of the alliances involved in the Blitz. Even leaders, I think. Kigos admitted that his decision making during this time was maybe not the best. What's really interesting though is that Silent War was actually kind of proof of concept, because as soon as he did that, other alliances started shrinking or foregoing declarations of war entirely, and Rose has done it a lot since. And the rationale isn't like urgency. Because there was like 3 to 6 months between wars. They had plenty of time to draft like 100-word declaration of, not 100-word, 100-page declarations of war. The reason they don't post longer declarations of war is because it opens them up to revenge wars. So if you say in a DOW, this is the reason why I'm fighting, then your opponent can flip that, or they can argue it in their declaration of war or a future one. So by posting nothing, you're shielding yourself from argument, and you're also diminishing your own role within the coalition. Because the alliances that do post declarations of war, like that's where all of the ire and the discussion will be focused, and it will seem like those alliances are driving the coalition, even if in reality they're not. So this was he's probably not the first to do it, but it was, I think, the most high-profile instance. So this is very unfortunate for the state of the game now, because it's also private and the CBs are kind of atrocious. I mean, it's got a little bit better, I think, in the last war, but generally they're really bad. Like, it's terrible for bystanders, because like they're all on high taxes now, or city circles, or they're also rich that they don't really require the market. So like the politics is all they have to sort of like look at or become interested in, and there's none of it because all of it's private. So after resigning, Kigos appointed Belisarius as temporary emperor, or Temperor of Rose, and Belisarius sought to end the war and elect a new leader. So he went to peace talks with his newly appointed regent Dermage. Despite Rose having only attacked TKR and Guardian, TS also had a representative in these talks. Interesting. So after much debate, Rose was required to pay Guardian a staggering 1 billion in reparations, partly through steel. My understanding is that like TS did not contribute to the reparations. If anything, they might have tempered their allies, trying to avoid that. I'm pretty sure that was mainly a Guardian thing. I think even TKR sort of made mention of it not being ideal. But I think that's like the small bits of information I picked up here and there might be totally inaccurate. So this is what I mean by like they sort of propagandize things by like including some facts, which sort of imply other things. But yeah, I don't know. It's kind of weird. Like they could add a lot more information here, but they kind of choose not to. They also agreed to allow Sindasphere to fight Rose's whale nations. This is huge. I did not know that started with Sindasphere. This was followed up. This term here is commonplace in a number of other wars, and it is universally, I think, considered one of like the harshest terms you can impose. The reps was already insane. 1 billion is very high in terms of reps. I think the highest reps ever paid was in the range of like 6 billion or something. 5 is also still very rare. 3 is somewhat more commonplace. But 1 is still very high reps. You don't see that in any globals now. You don't see reps at all, really, in globals now. But yeah, 1 billion back then would be like 10 billion today, or maybe 20. It'd be insane. They also agreed to allow Cindersphere to fight Rose's Whale Nations, blah, 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 for an additional 2 rounds. So they probably lost another almost $1 billion in infra. So many in Rose felt that the latter term was unnecessarily harsh, but Belisarius himself didn't complain, and without much fuss, the whales let their pixels be torched. Aftermath and elections. Nevertheless, peace returned over the course of the war. A huge portion of Rose's active membership began planning to leave. Furthermore, the Sketchy massacre took place, in which the then Econ deputy Sketchy kicked roughly half the alliance on account of poor activity. Pubstomper and Lilac Veritas were considering heading out to set up a new alliance, and members wanted to try other alliances as well. Faced with a massive potential exodus, Belisarius began trying to sell the idea of reforming Rose after the war. He then made one last comment in the government channel after resigning, where he encouraged the remaining government to outline a mission for Rose and sell it to the membership. It would be interesting if they shared what the mission was. Like, they surely have that document or post that these members constructed. And that would tell us a lot about Rose. But I guess you can read into what it contained by their later actions. I'm trying to read in a bit into why the members left, because the members they were fighting beside VE and Covenant, which I guess they had on and off. They had been doing that for a while. I guess it's just because they'd lost a few wars in a row. The morale was very low. So this is talking a lot about elections. This is interesting. Well, actually, I guess the whole section is somewhat interesting because it tells you about Rose. So, and their internals. So the elections were closely contested. The 2 main candidates were Lilac and Dermage. Dermage had been a rising star in Rose's government as Kikos's IA head, and Lilac had been Econ. Both players were on friendly terms and ran on not terribly dissimilar campaigns that emphasized transparency and government and advocated attempting to cooperate with Cindersphere, though they differed on who they thought would be viable allies. Yes, they were trying to avoid losing. Lilac's attention was on TS directly, while Dermage, seeking to wrest all the bad blood and ancient grudges between the 2 groups, wanted to sign Mensa. This is a very famous reconciliation that happened mostly through their forums. But after getting to know some members' Mensa's membership through chatting and playing games with them, Dermage felt there was potential for a real friendship between these 2 old enemies. I don't know if they ever accomplished that real friendship. If anything, I mean, this was kind of a capitulation for Rose. Mensa was the weaker of the 2, in terms of size. But they were in the winning coalition. I think Mensa would have also vetoed Rose's participation in that coalition. So approaching Mensa directly, rather than trying to circumnavigate them with trying to circumnavigate them with TS was probably the wiser move. I think if they approached TS directly, they probably would have failed, just from my understanding of it. The vote was conducted in 2 rounds, with the first round of voting being used to narrow the field down to 2 candidates. We know the 2 candidates, so that's kind of arbitrary. It is now known that former members who were still in the forums but were not official alliance members had voted in this election. With potential fraud in his hand, Belisarius, rather than making the alliance vote again, he simply made them work together. Okay. Interesting. I thought Dermage worked with Sketchy, but maybe that comes later. Dermage and Lilac initially settled on a compromise in which Dermage would assume leadership and Lilac would be second in command but have leader rank in-game. However, both candidates had listed Oblige, Kigos' econ head, in their election platforms as regent. Okay. Following the result of the October 2016 elections, a set of reforms called Rose 2.0 was announced. They had a really cool flag for Rose 2.0. And it's gone. Oh wait, here it is, yeah. It was a pretty cool flag. I think it's based on, yeah, not so cool flag in some ways, but I think it's based on the Shogunate or something. But yeah, it works very well. Rose 2.0. We're trying to like find interesting parts. Okay, so they were able to land the MDP with Mensa HQ. I think the reactions will be, yeah, 435 days of being on opposing sides. After this signing, FARC, with whom Rose had no DOP since November 2015, cancelled immediately. That makes sense. Like, they were fighting Mensa HQ forever. They obviously had allies that were still predisposed to disliking Mensa. And they picked up Lordaeron. Lordaeron is another chaotic alliance. Treasure Island, an alliance created by Sindosphere in order to abuse the alliance treasure bonus, was formed during the Lermage and Lilac leadership. See, this is like the very little communication of what even happened here. Short version, Sindosphere, the like de facto hegemony in the game right now, they were way more powerful than Paragon, especially without Rose. Sindosphere created a super alliance led by the Syndicate called Treasure Island, where they united almost the entire block's membership in a single alliance, stacked every treasure in the game in that alliance, and had like a 40% income boost on all of those nations. The revenue that they produced was so insane that it made their hegemony, like their relative power compared to Covenant, like it was such a huge gap that they would never even come close to passing it. Even like, I think they gained like a 5 or 10 city lead on them in terms of like average city count. It's crazy. And yeah, Rose was initially left out, and Black Knights and some other alliances were either sort of like left out or they didn't participate for various reasons. And every alliance that was left out had like such bad blood about it, even if it wasn't like overt, and they didn't state it in their history. Like, that was a really big deal because Treasure Island basically separated which alliances would be the great powers moving forward from which alliances were in decline. So yeah, Rose was probably really annoyed about that for a very long time. But okay, yeah, so Mensa HQ managed to get them in. And Sindosphere Syndicate was suspicious. And they hadn't yet earned a real seat at the Sindosphere table, i.e. they didn't make decisions. They were following along in wars. So around this time, there were some changes in government, as one of the three leadership figures, Oblige, left due to disagreements over Milcom, and Sketchy began to take on more responsibilities in FA and general alliance management, as it became clear he was an excellent candidate for leadership in the near future. The 50% of the membership that he kicked would probably disagree, but the 50% that remained definitely did agree. So Rose and Mensa would clash with GOT Sphere on several occasions. No context on what GOT Sphere is, again. So Seven Kingdoms had formed its own sphere because, it wanted to be a third pole. Right? The game was bipolar between Sindosphere and Parakov, and Seven Kingdoms was like, we want to be like the third sphere, like back in 2015 when the game was divided into three spheres, tripolarity. And they teamed up with an alliance called Valyria, which was like 10 micro-alliances merged into one huge alliance that was held together by like hopes and dreams, and little else, and it exploded soon after. Rose and Mensa would clash with GOT Sphere, with incidents ranging from raids by Valyria Gov members to poaching our allies. It speaks volumes about how much distance the new government had put between themselves and the previous regime, given this was a rival with an SK-led sphere, and Rose's CB for Silent War was a preemptive defense of Seven Kingdoms. So these tensions ended up culminating on Dio's War on Christmas, which led to Valeria disbanding and GOT sphere crumbling. Rose would also join in on Papers, Please. So yeah, what this is saying, I guess, sort of explicitly, with a little bit of information I have to share about Papers, Please, this is saying that Rose is basically doing its part, humbling itself, and putting their old interests to bed to earn its place in Cindersphere. Right? It's not betraying its old ally, but it's turning away from its old ally, Seven Kingdoms, and it's teaming up with Cindersphere to crush Terminus Est and Papers, Please, and all the paperless alliances, Arg and Rosway and the rest. Terminus Est, it was one of the few whale alliances which could stand up to Cindersphere, and Papers, Please ended with Terminus Est disbanding, and most of those whales ultimately sort of folding into Cindersphere. So, I guess the best way to contextualize this is, I think they must have presumed, the game was almost over, right? That Cindersphere had won, and that Rose just needed to sort of secure its own place in that sphere. And this was also a betrayal in the sense that Rose hired Arg and Pirates to proxy TS, and now it was participating in Papers, Please, which was an attempt to end piracy in PNW and destroy all the pirates. So yeah, that's rough. That's a big change for Rose. One of the most enduring legacies of Dermage's leadership has to do with elections. Prior to Dermage, the established practice in Rose was that leaders would typically appoint their successors, even though the old charter required elections to be held for new leaders. Okay, so he changed the elections. Okay, so he made the alliance more democratic. That's interesting. I don't think it's actually changed all that much. Even though the leaders don't pick a successor in the same way they used to, there's still a lot of politicking where the preferred leader it's very clear, and people do have voting blocks, and old leaders aren't meant to tell their members who to vote for, but they very often do, unfortunately. Easy mode coalition, sketchy. So upon the conclusion of Damage's term as leader, elections were held in February 2017, in which Sketchy became leader and Damage became second in command. Sketchy had made major contributions to the alliance in since early 2016, working in Econ and serving as head of Econ. Around this time, a new sphere called the Inquisition was formed by MPO, who after the deaths of Paragon, GOT, and Paperless, were pretty much the last bastion of opposition to the sprawling mass of Cindersphere. They brought BK, Zodiac, and Cornerstone from Cindersphere, created a new major power block to oppose them, the defining feature of global politics, and almost became the sphere rivalry between the low-tier focused IQ and the mid-high-tier Cindersphere, or Easy Mode Coalition as they were now known. I think most people still call them Cindersphere, until TS left after Trail of Tears. But anyway, context. Parakov and Cindersphere were continuing to rival each other, and MPO reached out. Oh, not MPO. Black Knights had a disagreement, which was an alliance in Cindersphere, had a disagreement with the Knights Radiant, and as a result, then Black Knights pulled a bunch of Cindersphere alliances out and teamed up with Parakov. Right, so basically it was a Cindersphere civil war. But yeah, basically it was a Cindersphere civil war, and half of the civil war was allied to their arch nemesis, Parakov, and MPO. So under Sketchy, Rose's identity as an EMC member finally began to take its shape. He pushed Rose's interests within the sphere and sought to maintain an independent FA approach. However, the great power politics at play inevitably brought EMC and IQ into conflict, and Rose would fight in Trail and Tears. in mid-2017, ultimately becoming a core member of the massive Easy Mode Coalition. In short, during the Civil War, Rose didn't defect to their old allies and betray Syndicate. They stuck with them. So yeah, that's why they earned their place. And there was probably a lot of pressure from their old allies to like finally take down Syndicate. And I think that was a fairly close war. So yeah, very interesting. Yet another new generation of government figures would gain prominence around this time, with Dynamic joining Logov IA, DTC becoming Milcom head, and Rebecca becoming FA head. The merge with the Viridian Entente was also a significant moment for Rose following the split within VE. Many in the group joined Rose, including whatever, and April a bug caused every nation in the game to join Rose. I sort of caused that bug with Ripper, or we discovered it. Ripper was Pirate Nog, but later Admiral Avog. Alex allowed the admin had coded in an update to loot. So instead of looting 10% of a nation's revenue, you were meant to be able to loot 14%. But because there was like a typo, he made it 40%. And to reverse this change, then he had to merge every nation in the game into a single alliance. And then he had to like delete every other alliance in the game or something. So yeah, Rose was for a moment the largest and only alliance in PNW. And there was some suspicions that the reason he chose Rose, because they weren't the number one alliance at the time, was because like Alex the admin was a Rose member in a different game or something. So like he had some affection for them back then, which is a very interesting like story, I guess, and narrative. I think it was put out by their allies or by like Syndicate people. That's from my memory. Yes, there was still some suspicion, even when they were firmly allied. So the breakup of Easy Mode Coalition and Red Army. Towards the end of 2017, as Sketchy and Dermish stepped down, Red Army became the leader of Rose after a close election between him and Callisto. Callisto ended up becoming his regent. During this time, Rose had to deal with the aftermath of Trail of Tears and the sprawling Easy Mode Coalition that had defeated the Inquisition. So, EMC. In order to set the Alliance and the wider world on a path of dynamic politics and smaller spheres, Red Army voluntarily broke apart EMC by ending Rose's treaties with Guardian Pantheon. Where's the part about the Syndicate? Did I miss that? Did I read over it too fast? Did they not mention it? Okay, context then. In case I missed it somehow. Syndicate left EMC after Trail of Tears, and then they became paperless. And then when they became paperless, then they also sort of discussed like the breakup of EMC. But a lot of EMC, which was the the hegemony at the time, they didn't want to break up. They were at their height. Why would they? And Rose, I think they sort of assisted Syndicate's like last wish for the blog by splitting it a little bit and moving away with Guardian and Pantheon. Or they ended the treaties with Guardian and Pantheon. I think Guardian and Pantheon stayed somewhat allied to TKR. And Rose moved away with Ragnarok, Bad Company, and some other smaller alliances. At the time there was IQ, the remnants of EMC being led by TKR, which was sort of the successor to the Sphere. Syndicate was paperless, and Rose was sort of an uneasy ally of EMC. But there was still like paperless ties between TKRTS and Rose. Like EMC had dissolved, but it hadn't entirely dissolved. And I think the expectation was that if they split up Cindersphere, then IQ would split up as well. And this was a particularly big issue because like IQ had concentrated all the lower tier players in the game, and the other coalition EMC had all the high tier players in the game. So all the wars were very boring. And lots of people at the top end and the very bottom end couldn't really participate. The first polity of Rose dynamic. Is this when they went Roman? Or is that later? Yeah, it is. It's either Roman or Greek. Oh, it's all three. Greece, Rome, and Carthage. Yeah, so Sketchy and Borhan, former head of FA for Men's HQ, they formed an alliance called the Golden Horde, sort of like a combination of Rose and Mensa. And AIM was... I have no clue what AIM was. I'm not sure who contributed to that. But whatever. Yeah, they were the successors to the Damage Restoration, and they had a Greek theme. Dynamic did a bunch of coding for them. I think this is... Yeah, okay, they invested more in their low tier. I don't know about that. They were still very like high tier at the time. But I guess they were trying to compete with IQ. A little bit. Dynamic was re-elected for a second term. Yeah, they fought a Nightfall. They had great net damage. See what I mean? Like, in the sense that, like what is the story here? They aren't telling us anything. That's almost all of 2018, 2019. From February to 2019, their leader changed. That is the great conclusion from their history. No insight into why they did much of any of these things. Very little context. And if you go to these pages, they don't elaborate all that much. You can like dive into the DOWs, but you know, they're not great. The end of Sovereign Zephyr. Okay. See, there was like a lot of Zephyr stuff like that sort of left out. Like he was alleged for like stealing resources from Rose. Like the early like Impulse stuff was really interesting because Rose came into that war kind of like as a surprise. So yeah, they could do more to tell their story. They changed their theme during Imbolt. That is the sum of Imbolt. That's a year of war. Damn, you know, what a history. I'm kind of disappointed. Their early history had like some elements that were kind of interesting, but the later history, they've completely like diminished it. My assumption here would be that they wrote this history as these events sort of went down, and they removed a lot of their politics from it for practical reasons, and they never got back to it. It's been 4 years, you know? No elaboration, no insight into their internals. I know some of it, but yeah. Post Impult, yeah, KT kept hitting their allies and betting wars. Valk was re-elected. I think Valk became like, I think the most. I think he did. Yeah, I think he was like the longest Rose leader or something, or he was very close to it. He was the longest continuous Rose leader. Makigos might still have the record for the most elections won or something, or most days in office. So during the first week of April 2020, Rose's longtime MDOAP ally Ming Empire merged into Rose. They're leaving out that Ming Empire was devastated and Empult by Carthago, which is a modern or recently disbanded alliance, but they were a kind of well-known alliance. The Rose then sort of had to work with on and off, so that was kind of rough for Rose, and there's probably some tension still there. But also, Ming Empire was 70% multis. They'd merged a micro-alliance and then tiered them up. The leadership of Ming Empire, that was. They merged a small alliance, they built them up, and then it turns out all of them were multis. And they had to basically compile a Google sheet or an Excel sheet or something with how many resources they'd given to these new alliances, and then submit it to the admins to get even like 5% of it or something back, because otherwise it would have just crippled every player involved. You know, they lost billions, tens of billions. It's crazy. Oh, and Ming Empire was also a successor to Ragnarok, which, yeah, this doesn't even really properly explain either. So there's so much history that's being, like, sort of ignored. And that does affect Rose, because that was, like, the loss of one of Rose's biggest and most long-time allies. And they also completely glossed over the fact that they lost TFP. And TFP was an ally from like 2016 or something, to like 2021. It was like a 5-year treaty. Let's see. I don't know. This has taken so much longer than I thought it would. I thought this would take me like 10 minutes and then I would comment on it. But no. Honestly, I should have started with the end, because the end just seems very brief. Yeah, Rose, in 2020, they started like taking off in growth. The growth is insane. In short, for Duck Hunt, they teamed up with, after Empult ended, then the winning coalition, EMC 2.0 or whatever, Coalition A. Coalition A disbanded, but half of Coalition A stuck together, Syndicate and the Knights Radiant, and they formed a sort of new hegemony, and the rest of the game combined and defeated them. Yeah, they don't really elaborate much here either. Quack began hitting Swamp and Hegemony. The forces of Rose intercepted the Blitz with their own Blitz, and thus Duck Hunt started with Rose as one of its main combatants. And then the war ended after it reached 1 trillion in damages. I don't believe there are any terms either. Maybe just surrender. Yeah, so just defeat. Guns N' Roses. Yeah, so Quack disbands. Tikia then immediately teams up with Hegemony to create Hollywood, another sort of hegemonic force because they had all the whales. And then they rolled Rose, which I think they believed orchestrated, what's it called? Duck Hunt. And then Oasis and Mystery and the rest came in to defend Rose. And yeah, they lost. Syndicate and Rose then teamed up and defeated Hollywood, sort of as revenge, but also because Hollywood was way too strong. Yeah, war ended with surrender of Hollywood 3-month nap. Valk retires, Lucianus takes over. Clock hits Rose. Do they mention the Kigos leaks? They do not. So, context on this. At the end of the year, after having just worked with Syndicate against TKR, then Syndicate is kind of worried about Rose's growth, so Syndicate works with Clock to defeat Oasis and Mystery, two alliances which helped Rose earlier in the year, and then as payment for their help, then Clock would roll to Rose for the Syndicate. And Rose developed a bit of a grudge over this, which they later pursued. But immediately after this war, then Clock leaked that it was the Syndicate that was responsible for hiring them, basically, or inviting them to hit Rose. But Rose still had to team up with Syndicate to form a Celestial to combat Hollywood again. So the coalition between Syndicate and Rose was more powerful than Hollywood, but it was also more divided, and that this division ultimately led to them losing another global, called the Fault in Our Stars. The way the cookie crumbles. I don't think it's really explaining this either. Rose and Eclipse declared war on GGO on September 2nd. Theming it as a birthday party. Was it just... I think they're skipping stuff. They're skipping like major events. So you lack like context. And even I'm struggling with context. And this isn't that far gone. Like this is pretty recent. Yeah, after Hollywood disbanded, after they defeated Syndicate and Rose, then Rose teams up with Eclipse and rolls Grumpy, Guardian, KT, and some other like whale alliances in December of that year. And then it's after that that they sort of sit on the sidelines of a few wars. Bifrost Blitz. People have weird names for wars. I don't really remember these leaks. I made a video on the topic too, and I still don't really remember them. Yeah, okay, so I guess there were leaks during a war. Rose retaliated because of that. Solomon takes over. Rose hits Eclipse and TS because of size. And that's the end of that. Damn, that took a lot out of me. Reading through a lot of very droll history. I shouldn't have tried to read it. Trying to read it was the failure. It was a mistake. Anyway. I wonder if this will be entertaining. It might be a little bit entertaining. A tad. Let's think. I had plans, because I only thought that would take me like 10 or 20 minutes. I did not expect for it to almost take 2 hours. Let's think on what is the character of the Alliance? From the history that we've read, what are the trends and consistent elements which we can derive from this story? I think first and foremost, which I picked up on early, was that they are very sensitive to the opinions of other alliances. They are interested in sort of the narratives of wars, and that they are sort of, they consider themselves not a mover and shaker, but more as sort of a bystander, or a less active participant. Which is interesting, because that sort of continues today. And that could be political strategy, or it could just be how they perceive like themselves, I guess. They have been, since the beginning, like a top 5 alliance. And I don't think that has really at any point changed. Well, their outlook at least hasn't changed. So from 2014 to 2024, 10 years, they've been in the top 5, competing for number 1. And I think even when they founded them, like they founded Rose, Alice became Rose, they were number 1. So they started at number 1, they're currently number 1. That's an interesting sort of journey. So I guess in some sense they were never really a rising power. Like it was a very brief rise. And they're more of a... They're not a status quo power. But yeah, they're trying to reclaim glory more often than achieving it for the first time. I think they've always managed to find themselves in large coalitions, but in each instance, then they were always on the periphery of the large coalition. In Paragon, they cancelled Covenant because they didn't want to be in the middle. Instead, they preferred to be on the edge of VE. With Duck Hunt, then they were probably the glue that helped bring, Midgard and Hegemony together. But like they came in at the last minute. They weren't the leading force. The alliance that took the hits in that war was Midgard. What else is there? In terms of internally, it seems like they have a big community focus. There's lots of mentions of like drama and people like switching out, but from the general trend, it seems like their leadership changes based on sort of the requirements of like the diplomatic requirements. They change their leaders to avoid getting rolled. They change their leaders to repair relations. And they, like, their democracy is functional, like it is a democracy, but it is also warped, where leaders still have influence. And that's very early on, with people like directly appointing their successor, and even later on with like Valk passing things off to Lucianus, right? Who is his like second in command or de facto successor, even though the second in command was different. So those are some trends we can deduce. I think that's sort of it. I think Rose sort of sees itself as politics and war's balancing power, right? Where they stand on the sidelines and they prevent any one alliance from controlling the game, right? And they mostly pursue their own interest and try and stay in the top 5, which is interesting. There's no like moral judgment you can make, or there's very little traditional propagandizing. I think the TS version of this will be very different, where TS is like, we were the good guys, whereas Rose doesn't really try that, and that is also reflective of their character. I guess it would be interesting to think about where they're going to. The TS version is short. I didn't know that. I thought it was quite long. Well, you know what? I eagerly await the TS version, which I'll probably do another day, because I wish this was like a half the size, but I simultaneously wish it was 10 times the size, because it feels like they explained almost nothing in every paragraph. But at the same time, that took so long to read. And I don't want to do that again. I wish they bullet pointed it. But anyway. It wasn't a 168 day. Oh wait, that's when the TS version ends. Okay, that's interesting. I mean, honestly, if Rose had done the same, I'd probably be fine with it. If they had a really solid intro, and then they cut it off at a certain point, which is like, and we'll reveal the rest later, I would have been cool with that. Instead of just sort of it ended ungracefully or whatever. It was not very entertaining in that final half. Though maybe I'm being overly harsh. But yeah, what about future trends? What can we expect from them? Well, I think they're going to continue with the same strategy. I don't think we've really seen anything to imply that they're changing. If anything, I think this sort of reveals how consistent they've been. I think even like looking back to the Reformation, did the character of Rose change substantially during that Reformation? Probably. The individuals probably changed. The competency 100% changed. But I don't know, they're still kind of in the same place in the world. Yeah. Like, in contrast to, like, UPN, for example. UPN changed radically, in contrast to Rose. UPN went from being number one height of the on top of the world, on top of the mountain, to, like, falling down head first and landing at its base and never being able to re-summit it, to reach the summit again. So yeah, it's a testament to their skill that they managed to stick around this long. Although, I mean, a number of the other major alliances of the day have also done so. Seven Kingdoms didn't, VE didn't, but Syndicate, Guardian, and a bunch of their peripherals have maintained their power. Or even if they disbanded like Mensa, there's stuff like the Golden Horde, which it comes back in like a month or two and gains 300,000 score. Absolutely insane progress. Yeah, this was interesting. I have no idea how to end this now. I think I had way more planned, and unfortunately, that took so long that my mind is melted. I would actually love to have access to the PDF, because if I can read a PDF of Syndicate stuff, and sort of compare and contrast to the wiki, or if it complements the wiki, that'd be great. Rose probably has a more elaborate uh, private history. I would expect they have one for their FA stuff or something. I'll have a drink. Then I'm gonna think. This was a mistake. Tackling Rose first was the mistake. It's a good place to start because it's the number one alliance and that interests people. But that was really long, and some of it was interesting and some of it really wasn't. And I was not expecting to need to add context to so many points in that history, and I don't know if I told it in all the right ways. I will ponder what I can do better next time. For now, that was the history of Rose, as told by them, with some commentary and context from me. We can derive some trends from it, which we can use to find their alliance's character. And I think an alliance's character is important because this is a game full of characters, and alliances are those characters as much as the individuals are, because alliances are shaped by their histories. And I'm looking forward to what becomes of them next. But also, I think the peripheral characters are perhaps more interesting. I think when you're in the top 5, you have to be more focused on surviving till the next century, as one character once put. And yeah, I think that's what has preoccupied Rose for most of their existence. I don't think they've had much room to express themselves in other ways, which is kind of interesting. Because that's partly their strategy. Like, they've chosen that. Because Syndicate, I think in contrast, and Terminus Est and Seven Kingdoms, all of those characters, I think, are way more engaging to some people. They are more clearly characters, right? They express rage and love and everything in between. Rose, from what I've seen here, really doesn't do that. They've had a few grudges, but they've had to set them aside more often than not. Whether they liked an alliance or disliked an alliance didn't matter. What mattered was surviving. And that's cool. Until next time. I'll probably try and host another one of these at the same time next week. Though hopefully, fingers crossed, half the length and twice as interesting. Because this was an interesting attempt. But yeah, way too much stuff to read. See you for now.